the abyss because people can't connect with what you're saying. And so the timing is rather fortuitous, if a little depressing. When I started when I applied for the funding to the Marsden Fund to write the book, the global financial crisis had just happened. Right? And I don't think, well, I might be underestimating others in the room, but I certainly didn't have a clear sense of what was going to happen. I had a feeling that this might be the beginning of something big, but being a lawyer, I of course immediately focused on the legal and regulatory side of things, and it took me a little while before I started to think that maybe I needed to step back and get a bigger picture of the issues. Now, I know there's some people in the room who were present at the launch that we did in the National Library, so I want to try to focus on some other aspects of the book. But before I do, I want to do my thank yous. First set of thank yous is to Bridget Williams Books, without which much of the material published in this country wouldn't see the light of day, and we need to find ways that we can continue to support those publishers being able to put New Zealand critical content out there to stimulate the New Zealand debate. And I know that Bridget Williams Books has a trust which requires ongoing support to be able to do this work, so I encourage... I didn't do that. That's my publisher. Oh dear. The second thank you is to the Marsden Fund, and long may it survive whatever intentions governments have of it. I was lucky that I was the first, as I understand it, first legal scholar to get a Marsden grant, and since then some of my colleagues have as well. And I'm really hoping that that has started a trend where the kind of insights that we might bring from our discipline can help inform the discussions that are supposed to be supported by Marsden. And the third is the Law Foundation, which is quite unique, has been very supportive of me in various ways, and they've assisted in the publication of the book. And so I really want to say how important it is for those of us who write these tracts that may or may not fly, have that kind of support. And I think we've got to fight for it in the next 5 or 10 years because it's going to come under pressure. And there's my wonderful publisher. You missed the promo, Bea. As I said, when I started writing the book, it was at the time of the immediate fallout from the GFC. And luckily, the other obsession in my life took over, and I was having to balance writing this with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement analysis. And that was very good because it meant that it has slow brewed. And as it has slow brewed, we've got more and more insights about what is happening in the crisis of financialised capital, and more insights as well about the kind of transformations that seem to be embryonic. And this is the theme of what I want to talk about today. From what I can see in the room, virtually everyone here will be familiar with Polanyi's work on the Great Transformation. My work also draws very heavily on Gramsci, and both of them were about transitions at times of crisis from one era or paradigm to another. And the more I wrote and the more I read and the more I talked to people in countries like Ireland and Iceland, the more it became apparent to me that we were in a period of interregnum. What Gramsci described as one period dying, the next period yet to be born. There are lots of morbid symptoms that emerge, and responses to it can be repressive, or responses to it can be progressive, and we have a responsibility for helping to shape what that transformation will look like. And so the book, whilst it is in a way a follow-up to the New Zealand experiment, many years on, 20 years on, it is a forward-looking book. It is about what are the kinds of crises that we can see erupting, what are the kinds of challenges, where do we in this country fit into that model, what are the kinds of obstacles that exist to us being able to transform into a different paradigm, and how do we organise to do so. Now, in that sense, I was quite relieved, it's probably the only part of Piketty's book I was relieved by, when I read his comments about our role as intellectuals. And he was quite clear, if I can find the right space, he was quite clear that what we needed to be doing was to take back the economics from the economists, that the economists needed themselves to stop peddling the same old troubled orthodoxies, and that those of us who aren't economists need not to be scared by numbers or scared by labels of voodoo economics or other kinds of denigration, but we actually need to recognise the links between financialised capitalism and the crisis that confronts it now, and the kinds of work that we do in our disciplines. And that's very much what the book is about. So the first part of the book, which I'm only going to talk about briefly, is about fire. And the title of the book, The Fire Economy, is borrowed from John Bellamy Foster's acronym, Finance, Insurance and Real Estate. We have now, that has emerged in the maturing of the shifts from the early 1970s, a system where wealth creation is built around finance, insurance, and real estate. The old days, when you actually invested money in making things that had real jobs, that sold in real shops, gave way. And Bruce Jesson wrote very early on about these transitions in this country. And when you have a system of capital that becomes dependent on credit and becomes dependent on making money out of largely borrowed money, you have an intrinsic instability in the system, but you also have a vulnerability in a social sense, in that the inequalities that attach to that create vulnerabilities for those who are the most indebted and capacities for those who are the beneficiaries. And those capacities become political capacities that are reflected in how the state is structured and in the rules by which the state operates. And when I said at the beginning that you always worry about how a book's going to be received, well, we in this country who now have this terribly shallow economy based on farm and fire can see the vulnerabilities at work. the vulnerabilities of what exists in our productive economy being centred around dairy, largely low value added dairy exports, and what happens with the commodity crisis as the cycle turns down. But that in itself is also part of FIRE. One of the reasons why there is such concern about the downturn in the farm part of the FIRE economy is not what happens to the farmers. It's not what happens to the rural communities. It's not what happens to the surrounding services of the schools and the hospitals and so on. It's not the social dimension of the farming economy. It's that rural real estate is now so overvalued and so heavily leveraged that the banks are very vulnerable to the downturn in the dairy economy. And as we had that commodity boom in dairy, so we had conversions of farms into dairying, so we had the price of the farms escalating, and you see now that even the Reserve Bank in its regular reporting is highlighting the risks to the financial system of a collapse in the dairy prices because of the collapse potentially in the dairy market, and there goes the collateral that the banks have for that lending. If we look at other parts of the FIRE economy, we see the crucial importance of finance. Not only finance in terms of the banking sector, but more specifically, finance in the way that the banking sector has maximised its profits by peddling out cheap money. Cheap money, especially in the property markets. That is the place where they make the most money. That money comes largely from offshore, and certainly has for over a decade. The Reserve Bank has been trying to haul that back a little, but that has contributed to a massive amount of external debt. And so whilst we have here this obsession with public debt, the privatised debt that has occurred goes unnoticed. And so the finance sector is an issue not just because of the operation of the banks and their dominance within the economy itself, and there's a nice graph that Bill helped me draw because I'm not good with numbers, that shows how that shift has occurred in terms of total GDP. But it's the banks as the supplier of the credit that makes up the gap for the falling real wages and the inability of the real economy, if we're going to call it that, to be able to provide sustainable livelihoods and a vibrant domestic economy. And one of the interesting things for me to see was the extent to which that external debt and indeed the private debt escalated during the golden years of the Labour government. Consumption was boosted dramatically by the amount of borrowing. And the borrowing was borrowing from households, and the level of debt that we have, which for some is debt that is invested in speculation, in the big picture kind of speculation. Some, the rollover that the only way you can get ahead now is buying a house with borrowed money and then selling it 3 months later, or maybe that's just the Auckland phenomenon, but that's certainly what happens with us. And that's how people see that you make money. Or people who are desperate to be able to pay their rent and pay their bills and who borrow from the loan sharks. And the level of household debt is just staggering in this country. So that part of FIRE is critical. If we look at the Reserve Bank saying, where are the growth areas in the economy, not only was it the rural sector, but it also was in the construction post-crisis in Christchurch. Now again, leaving aside how thin that is and whether we want disaster capitalism or not, that is insurance at work. That is funded through a mechanism that is integral to the fire economy. And I don't think for people in this country we paid any attention to insurance until we started to see the Canterbury earthquakes emerging. And the whole of that reconstruction, the whole of that boost to the New Zealand economy is actually through insurance. And then real estate speaks for itself. The other big boom, of course, has been in immigration. And what is it that immigration has added to the New Zealand economy? Real estate. Or construction workers down in the Christchurch Canterbury earthquake reconstruction. And what is worrying about that is not just the thinness of the economy and what happens if there is a crisis. If there is another crisis offshore, that creates problems with access to credit. But what happens if there is a domestic crisis? What happens if there is a recession as a consequence of the impact of the commodity price in dairy? What happens if there is another crisis in China that impacts, and there are lots of predictions about certainly the ongoing downturn in China that impacts on New Zealand's dependence on China for our export markets. So what happens to all these people? What happens to the economy? And what happens to the country if we have a major downturn? We have no safety nets. It's not quite true. We have very few safety nets. We have seen an ideology that supports minimalist regulation of all of those sectors so that we can foster innovation and growth of capital. Capital Markets Development Task Force that reported after the financial crisis was not about how to regulate the financial markets, it was about how to expand the financial markets. John Key's attempt to set up a financial services hub, make New Zealand the financial services hub of the Asia Pacific after the financial crisis. Innovation and putting New Zealand on the frontier. The notion of risk-based regulation or risk-tolerant regulation, because the growth of these sectors needs to be unfettered by precautionary regulation. It's better that you don't regulate and some go under than you over-regulate and you stifle innovation, which is aligned with the notion of responsibilization, which is a dreadful word, which is that provided we have enough reporting and surveillance and financial literacy, then we can expect you to take responsibility for your own decisions and bear the consequences for those decisions if something goes wrong. And so the aspects I look at in the book, in some specific detail about New Zealand, involve the areas of debt, and they look at various kinds of debt. They look at property debt, they look at student debt, and they look at consumer debt and loan sharks. And if you take that risk-tolerant, risk-based approach, you see it across the board with the finance sector. Equally, if you look at where the savings are, you see the same ideology. You see when you come to KiwiSaver, how many people realise that KiwiSaver is not government guaranteed? Labor talks about making KiwiSaver compulsory without a guarantee. Another form of saving, insurance. And we see what happened in Christchurch with the problems of the insurance companies owned by the two big Australian conglomerates, leaving people to look after themselves, effectively. We see the government saying, and Jerry Brownlee saying, well, we're not going to bail out uninsured people because that would set a very bad precedent. The finance companies, people who saved their money and put them into those whiz-bang Hanovers with those nice faces and those politicians on the boards. Who rang the alarm bells and said this is a problem? It went belly up, who pays? So responsibilisation is about the state privatising the responsibilities, the consequences of the dependency on credit and letting the financial markets and the financial institutions rip. Now that, in a very, very, very blunt nutshell, is the first part of the book. And one of the things I've done in the book is to look at how, at the current time, in a kind of snapshot, we sit in the international predictions of that being a potential crisis. And in the book, I use an awful lot of IMF research papers. And that might surprise people who think of the IMF as the evil empire. And the IMF was a key player in peddling the Washington Consensus and doing some very evil things to some countries. But the IMF has been in its own internal crisis for a number of years. Heavily discredited, not helped by people like Stiglitz, former insiders firing shots at them. And it has been setting about reinventing itself. And since around 2007, it has been recruiting really interesting people into its research unit. And they have produced heretical papers. And if you haven't read them, you should. They're even readable to people who don't do the figures. They have started talking truth to their own power. Of course, the board of the IMF is still governed by the shareholders. So there's an interesting tension there. But even Christine Lagarde has been giving speeches about talking about the need for an inclusive form of capitalism. Kinds of policies, including labour market policies, that would never have been considered tolerable in the era of the Washington Consensus. And they have been joined by others. Martin Wolf, former current Financial Times journalist, and former champion for the last 3 decades of the neoliberal transformation. An extraordinary book published just a few months ago saying, look, this is not working. We need to make changes. We need to make big changes. And if the changes aren't big enough and effective enough, we're going to have to make radical changes. So you've got stalwarts who are now saying this system is in crisis. Here we are in a cocoon. GFC didn't really affect us. We have a rock star economy. Maybe it's not looking so rock star anymore. I say in the book, one of the problems with rock stars is that they tend to have addictions, and our addiction is debt. And so when I looked at some of these IMF papers, there's one in particular which looked at what have been the main triggers of financial crises over the last couple of decades. And they identified four recurrent features over that period of time. A credit boom and rapid financial expansion. Rapidly rising asset prices, especially in housing. Financial innovations that rely on favourable economic and regulatory conditions, and financial liberalisation and regulatory frameworks that allow all this to happen. And they said that's common features that we've seen in the crises, whether it's the Asian financial crisis or the Argentine crisis and so on. But they say since the global financial crisis, we can see 4 more features that make potential for crises much greater. The first is a sharp rise in household debt and consequent defaults. Now, our level of household debt is amongst the highest in the OECD, and it has doubled in terms of the amount of household income required to pay the debt over a period of time. The second is that household debt is largely backed by illiquid assets. And those illiquid assets have their value based on property booms. So you have household debts tied to illiquid assets. Third, which is not so much the situation here, although we do have some of it, is the growth of complex derivatives, which have intensified the instabilities as well as the invisibilities of what is happening in the shadow financial systems. And the fourth is the depth of financial integration, which in New Zealand we have almost more than anywhere else, given the foreign ownership of our finance and insurance system. And you find a number of these papers, and it's really quite unnerving, and Bill and I kind of exchange occasionally when the next ones come up. They mention us. Yeah? And that's scary, and we don't see that referred to here. And so what I then started doing once I understood something about what was happening with those dynamics was to go and talk to people in countries that had had crises. And I spent quite a lot of time in Iceland in summer, which they have about 3 weeks of. So I kept going back at that time of the year. And people in Ireland. And there was a really interesting contrast, and I'll come back shortly to some political lessons for that. But both of those crises were homegrown. Ireland was a property crisis, Iceland was a banking crisis. They were intensified by the global financial crisis, but they were small countries that were captive of the finance industry and of minimalist regulation. Risk-tolerant regulation, responsibilisation, and economies whose guts had been stripped out from them. The second part of the book is going to the neoliberal side. And this is where the lawyer bit comes back in. When the GFC happened, there were some really grand statements, including from Australia's Kevin Rudd, who declared that the age of neoliberalism was over, that the neoliberal emperor has no clothes. Although his alternative version of a post-neoliberal era was actually Keating, which those who know about Australia's neoliberalism will know it actually started there. But you had a whole variety of people making really quite grand statements. Yet, 2 or 3 years on, nothing had changed. The old ones were still in power. The rich had paid very little for the financial crisis. The poor had paid a lot. There had been some re-regulation, but limited re-regulation, especially in the heartland of the fire economy of Wall Street and the City of London. And so I started engaging much more with the question of why is neoliberalism fragile? Why does it help create conditions for crises? But why does it always also appear to be resilient? What is it that is embedded in the neoliberal framework that not only brought about the transformation in the 70s and 80s, but which has normalised it, which has made the primary mechanisms that the fire economy relies on, orthodoxies that are largely unquestioned, and how even when in countries other than this they are questioned, they remain largely intact. So what is it that makes it so robust? And one of the questions for me in that was, how do we understand policy and regulation outside our little silos that we're interested in? Many of us will look at labour policy, or we'll look at tax policy, or we'll look at environment policy, or climate change, or whatever's our area of particular interest. And it became very clear to me that the issues were actually systemic. The more we focus just on silos and don't see the connections between the silos, the more problematic it will be to undo it, because we're not actually seeing where the cement is. What ties it together? Where's the systemic power of neoliberalism? So we had to see not only outside our silos, but we also had to eschew the grand narratives of globalization and globalized neoliberalism and all of that stuff, to look at the nuts and bolts of how the system works. Because whilst there are similarities in various countries, there are also national differences. And in this country in particular, from 1984, when the changes were made, the architects had a very particular mission. That mission was not only to transform the state to support the transition in wealth, but also to make it as undoable as possible. And I rely quite a lot in the book on Murray Horn's book, which is built on his PhD thesis, which sets out remarkably, frankly, the different kinds of techniques that were necessary to avoid what is called the commitment problem, that future governments might actually want to change tack, or political slippage, or what some of the comrades in the Business Roundtable will call the problem of democracy, or even despotic democracy. And that helped me make sense of what I had already focused on a lot in the New Zealand experiment, which was the core pillars of, or what they often refer to as the economic constitution. The Reserve Bank Act, and the way that the structure of the Reserve Bank Act with the independent board and the exclusive price stability objective was a very deliberate design feature. Likewise, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, much weaker in its real effect, but quite powerful in its normative influence. Both of them requiring confessions of a government if the government decides that it's going to deviate. And the fire alarms will ring, and we will have a crisis of investor confidence, and we will have, remember that early 2000s when the changes were being made to the labour laws in the ACC, yeah? The orchestrated fire alarms ringing. In addition, over time, it became clear to them, although this was not clear at the time that Horn was writing, that the international agreements were another vehicle for locking governments into that framework. But the one that struck me as the most important is the one that no one actually pays any attention to, which is the Public Finance Act. Public Finance Act is how the state distributes money into the state sector to do state stuff. And the theme through most of these is the role of contracts. The contractual state is incredibly powerful to those who control the contractual process, They define what the state can do, they define the relationships. Once you contractualise relations with the state to others, it doesn't matter if the contract is with the state or someone else, and you exclude all the externalities, all the social impacts, all of the communities that are affected, and you can engage in a privatisation of the functions of the state internally through creating competitive markets within the state and externally. In addition, once you reconstruct the public finance regime in that kind of way, you have more scope for bringing in what in a wonderful book called The Shadow Elite is referred to as the peripatetic influences, the consultants, the advisors, the purchase advisors to the minister of what functions you should purchase, the value for money reviewers of what the state should be doing. And if you look in the book and see who those are, they are very familiar, regular faces in this country, who are outside government, but wield enormous influence inside government, especially to maintain regimes that they were instrumental in setting up. And so, when I was looking at those, and there are some other elements as well that I'm not going to go into for the purpose of time, I then went back to think about crisis and transformation. If we have a crisis, or if we want to preempt a crisis by doing something differently, what do we have to undo? What are the barriers that have been erected that we are going to have to be able to get past? Because that tier of the Public Finance Act, the Reserve Bank Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the international treaties, pose enormous barriers. And then there are other elements such as the regulatory management regime and so on inside government. When I talked to the Irish, they said our problem was that we never had this debate. We had partnership politics. And then when partnerships stopped working, we just weren't there anymore. And so they had it all their own way. And then we had a crisis, and we had no effective voices. And so what we had was austerity politics come in because there was no contest. In Iceland, they said, we saw the crisis coming. We had discussions, we had a history of these cultural ethics, and we luckily also had a new coalition of old social democrats and left greens who were also feminists who were consolidating. And when the crisis came there, and they forced out of popular outrage the shadow government out of power, it was them who took hold with the IMF. And the IMF supported a very progressive response to the crisis. They supported the most vulnerable. They reconstructed the debt for the most vulnerable. They raised the minimum wage. They provided strong support to pensioners. They only did 3% cuts to government expenditure in the welfare sector, and a whole lot of similar things, including capital controls. Now, the IMF did that with Iceland. So the IMF is actually not so much the bad guy in Greece. It's the third part of the triumvirate. But in Iceland, despite the fact that they had a relatively successful post-crisis reconstruction, the progressive government lost at the next election. And when I talked to them about why that was, they said, well, the problem was we still never had the debate about neoliberalism, And we never had the debate about financialised capitalism. We blamed a few greedy bankers who we threw in jail, and everyone wanted everything to go back to the way it was before, where we had lots of money and we could go and buy lots of things and have lots of trips and lots of SUVs. And so we now have the potential, because the vultures have bought up our distressed debt, that we're going to have another crisis. So what are the lessons for this, out of this for us? I, in the concluding chapter of the book, talk about transformation, and I identify a number of factors that I think are necessary. And I'm only going to mention them very briefly. The first is that there has to be, and I think this is going to happen because of the way that transformations of capitalism work, there has to be a new socially embedded economic structure. And I'm not going to say whether socially, to say socially progressive capitalism causes all sorts of political debates I don't really want to go into. But there has to be something different, and it has to re-embed the economic and the social. There also has to be a change in ethics and values. The ethics and values that treat shareholder capitalism as the way you go, you strip the money out, the private equity funds come in, we own TV3, we don't actually care about broadcasting, we just care about restructuring it, doing an IPO and flicking it off. Tony Malloy, QC, tax lawyer, gave a very, very moving submission to the Select Committee on some of the finance reforms, and he said until the professions start becoming professionals again with ethos, then you can change all the regulation you like, but they'll find ways around the regulations. We need a shift in culture and ethos and values. The third thing that we need to have is we need to actually work out what we want the state to be. Not just reinstating what it was. We need to think, what is the state in the 21st century supposed to be doing? That means addressing Treaty of Waitangi issues. It means addressing responsibilities in unforeseen areas like climate change. And it involves looking at how we deal with redistribution issues and the gross inequalities that we have and other things. So we need to think of what we want the state to be, realising that it is not a benign phenomenon, and we need to work out how, in fact, MMP, when it can be captured by a party like ACT or United Future in a sympathetic state environment, might need rethinking. The fourth is we need to focus, and this is the job for those of us who work in policy and regulation, we need to understand these embedded neoliberal frameworks. We need to work out what are the alternatives to a Public Finance Act. How do we get the international debates that monetary policy focused on inflation is no longer credible in the international economic arenas? There's a big contest there. How do we discuss the sacrosanct Reserve Bank Act in a way that gets changes? How do we say the issue is not public debt under the Public Finance Act, under the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it's private debt. Right? So how do we break through the mechanisms that have been put in place? How do we neutralise the fire alarms, the Treasury boards that have just been put in as the private sector players in there, the performance framework reviews now being conducted in the public sector, the new policy just announced a couple of days ago based on the Productivity Commission's report about a new regulatory culture led from the top in the public sector, a productivity commission that has two former Treasury senior officials as commissioners. Not surprising that it's ended up as being a proxy for the business roundtable. So we need to rethink how we do those frameworks, because we can't change labour policy or welfare policy or environment policy unless we can change that framework. The fifth thing we need is the political will and backbone of political parties to not run away at the first suggestion of voodoo economics, which you'll remember is what happened when Russell Norman suggested that monetary easing might actually be a legitimate tool, happening elsewhere, but that was voodoo economics. And they changed. The Greens abandoned that position. And finally, we need to have the popular demand backed by a sense of urgency that we actually want to engage in debates about transformation and political moves to transformation before a crisis happens. And if we don't engage in that debate before a crisis happens, we're much more likely to end up like Ireland and end up with the austerity packages than we are Iceland, and at least have some prospects of something different. I've talked much longer than I was going to, but that's kind of what's in the book.
All right, first thing I'd like to do is, this is the book, this is the form to purchase it. We'd like you to make sure, because there isn't any books here, that we distribute it and that you fill it in tonight. And Bridget Williams is up there. If you put your stand